Moscow has always been a city that watches itself. Cameras in stairwells, neighbors who report on neighbors, microphones inside lampshades, men in cheap suits sitting in parked cars across from foreign embassies. By the summer of 1985, the Soviet capital had perfected the art of total surveillance. Every Western diplomat was tailed. Every embassy car was bugged. Every casual encounter on a Moscow street might be recorded by an operative of the 7th Directorate of the KGB. And yet, one Tuesday evening in mid-July, 1985, on a wide avenue called Kutuzovsky Prospect, a single bite of British chocolate became the most important act of espionage of the entire decade. A man stood outside a bread shop. He was short, thick-set, in his late 40s, in a worn jacket and corduroy trousers. He held a plastic shopping bag from a British supermarket called Safeway. To anyone watching, he was nobody. A tired Soviet citizen waiting for someone, perhaps. A man buying bread on his way home from work. But this man was Colonel Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky of the KGB. He was, at that moment, the most valuable Western intelligence asset on Earth. He had been a British spy for 11 years. The KGB had recalled him to Moscow 2 months earlier. They had drugged him. They had interrogated him. They suspected him, but they could not prove it. And now they were watching him, every hour of every day, waiting for him to make a single mistake that would justify a bullet to the back of his head. He was, in his own quiet words, under sentence of death. The Safeway bag was a distress signal. It was a plea for rescue, transmitted across a Moscow street to anyone from British intelligence who happened to be passing. It said one thing: "Get me out, or I die." What he needed in return was a sign, a confirmation, something so specific, so impossible to fake, that he would know London had heard him, and that a rescue plan, dormant for 7 years, was about to be brought to life. That sign would arrive in the form of a Mars bar. This is the story of how a chocolate bar saved a man's life, how a tiny British intelligence service outwitted the largest secret police force in human history, and how the constraints faced by the underdog created an operation so audacious that it has never been equaled before or since. To understand why a Mars bar mattered, you have to understand the world in which it was eaten. By the early 1980s, the Cold War had entered its most dangerous phase since the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 superpowers, armed with tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, faced each other across a divided Europe. Each side had built deterrence around a single, terrifying idea. If you strike first, we will still be able to destroy you. Land-based missiles in silos, bombers on alert, submarines hidden beneath the oceans, the arithmetic of mutual annihilation. But arithmetic depends on information, and information was the one thing neither side could ever fully trust. In Moscow, the KGB was the largest, best-funded, most paranoid intelligence agency the world had ever produced. By 1985, it employed roughly 480,000 officers and informants. It controlled the borders. It controlled the post. It read the diaries of Soviet schoolchildren. It had a directorate dedicated to following Western diplomats inside Moscow 24 hours a day, in shifts of 3 vehicles and 6 men. The 7th Directorate alone numbered in the thousands. They were called the Watchers, and they were everywhere. In Washington, the CIA had access to budgets the KGB could only dream of, spy satellites that could photograph license plates from orbit, listening posts in Turkey and Norway. The largest signals intelligence apparatus in human history. By any conventional measure, the Americans should have dominated the espionage war. And in London, there was a small, eccentric, chronically underfunded service called the Secret Intelligence Service, known to the public as MI6. It operated out of a drab tower block on Lambeth called Century House, where the elevators broke regularly and the windows were sealed shut against bugging devices. MI6 in 1985 had perhaps 2,000 staff worldwide. It had no satellites. It had no listening stations to compare with the Americans. It had a budget that the Soviets would have considered laughable. What MI6 had was something else. It had patience. It had a culture of running individual human agents over decades, not months. And it had something the CIA and the KGB both lacked: an institutional willingness to bet everything, including the lives of its own officers, on a single human being. That human being would turn out to be Oleg Gordievsky. Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky was born in Moscow on October 10, 1938. His father was an officer of the NKVD, the secret police force that became the KGB, and that had spent the 1930s sending millions of Soviet citizens to their deaths. His father wore his uniform on weekends. The family lived in a special apartment block reserved for the intelligence elite. His older brother, Vasily, joined the KGB's Directorate S, the unit that ran deep-cover illegal agents abroad. Oleg followed. He graduated from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations in 1961, fluent in German, Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian. He was recruited into the KGB and trained at the secretive academy known as School 101 in a forest outside Moscow. His first foreign posting took him to East Berlin in August 1961, where he watched the Berlin Wall go up around him, brick by brick, and felt something shift inside him. In 1966, he was posted to Copenhagen. He fell in love with the West. He listened to Bach in the city's churches. He read books that had been banned in the Soviet Union since before he was born. He danced badly at parties and drank good Danish beer, and began to ask himself the question that would define the rest of his life. What if everything I have been told is a lie? Copenhagen in the late 1960s was a revelation to a young KGB officer raised on Soviet propaganda. The shops were full. The newspapers criticized the government openly without anyone going to prison. Working-class Danes lived in apartments better than those reserved in Moscow for senior intelligence officers. The supermarkets had cheese counters that, by themselves, contained more variety than entire Soviet cities. Gordievsky walked through it all in his KGB-issued raincoat and tried, dutifully, to write reports describing capitalist decay. He could not find any. The answer came on August 21, 1968. Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia and crushed the Prague Spring. Gordievsky was in Moscow on leave. He stood in his KGB apartment and listened to the news on the radio and felt, in his own later words, that he had been transformed. The Soviet Union, he realized, was not a flawed experiment that might be reformed. It was a vast, sterile concentration camp, and he wanted out. But he did not defect. He did something far more difficult and far more dangerous. He decided to stay inside the system, climb its ladder, and betray it from within. The opportunity came in 1973. By then, he had returned to Copenhagen for a second tour. The Danish Security Service, called PET, had been watching him. They suspected he might be sympathetic, they told the British. And the British sent a man named Richard Bromhead, the head of the MI6 station in Copenhagen, to make contact. The recruitment took months of patience. There were chance meetings at a badminton court at 7 in the morning in temperatures of -6 degrees Celsius. There were quiet conversations over coffee. There was, eventually, a moment in the bar of a Copenhagen hotel when Bromhead admitted he was a British intelligence officer and Gordievsky admitted that he had not reported the contact to his KGB superiors. From that moment on, his life belonged to the British. Bromhead's instinct in that hotel bar would later be quoted across the literature of espionage. "I think you are one of the few who would speak honestly to me," he told the Russian. It was an act of trust offered first, before any commitment was demanded in return. Western intelligence services had spent decades trying to recruit Soviet officers with bribery and blackmail. The British, almost by accident, had stumbled on the only method that worked with this particular man. They had treated him as a person, not as a target. He refused to take money. He wrote, in a letter to the chief of MI6 in 1974, that his decision was not the result of irresponsibility or instability of character. It was, he said, a matter of conscience. He spied for ideology, not gain. MI6 gave him the codename Sunbeam in Copenhagen, and later Nocturne in London. To Margaret Thatcher, who would soon read his intelligence reports without ever knowing his real name, he was simply Mr. Collins. For the next 11 years, Gordievsky led two lives. In one, he was a rising KGB officer, attending Communist Party meetings, drafting reports for Moscow Center, climbing the long internal ladder of Soviet intelligence. In the other, he met MI6 handlers in safe flats, photographed KGB documents with miniature cameras, and slowly, file by file, cable by cable, exposed the inner machinery of the Soviet espionage state to the British. He was given training in clandestine tradecraft, so meticulous that, decades later, MI6 officers would still teach his methods to recruits. He learned how to spot surveillance. He learned how to lose it. He learned how to behave normally while carrying, in a coat pocket, the kind of material that would put him against a wall in front of a firing squad. So far, the story is one of an extraordinary recruitment, but it is also, at this stage, an ordinary one. Most spies are recruited. Most spies report for a few years, are caught or burnt out, and disappear into history. What happened next is what made Gordievsky different, and what made his eventual exfiltration the most important rescue operation of the Cold War. In June 1982, Oleg Gordievsky was posted to London. He arrived at the Soviet embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens as a counsellor, ostensibly a diplomat. In reality, he was an officer of the KGB's political intelligence line, codenamed Line PR. His job was to spy on the British. MI6's job was to make sure he did it brilliantly enough to get promoted. What followed was one of the most elegant operations in the history of intelligence. MI6 fed Gordievsky a steady stream of accurate but harmless information that he could pass to Moscow as his own. They engineered the expulsion of his rivals at the embassy. When the Oxford-educated MI5 officer Michael Bettany attempted to volunteer his services to the KGB London resident in 1983, Gordievsky alerted MI6. Bettany was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 23 years in prison. The KGB resident was expelled from Britain, and Gordievsky, the man who had quietly orchestrated his fall, moved up. The Bettany affair was, in its way, the moment Gordievsky stopped being merely a useful source and became indispensable. A serving MI5 officer had attempted to betray Britain to the Soviet Union, and only the existence of a Soviet officer secretly working for British intelligence had prevented the disaster. The case was held inside the smallest possible circle. Margaret Thatcher was briefed. The American CIA was not. MI6 understood, even at this early stage, that some secrets had to be kept even from the closest allies. Gordievsky's reporting from London was a comprehensive guide to the KGB's understanding of British politics, British trade unions, and British public life. According to Gordievsky's own later account, the KGB file on Jack Jones, the powerful General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, they recorded him as a paid contact during the 1960s and 70s, a claim Jones denied during his lifetime. Gordievsky also reported on a KGB attempt to cultivate the Scottish Labour Member of Parliament Ron Brown, an effort Soviet handlers eventually abandoned because Brown proved unusable as an asset. And he described, in detail, a KGB file on the former Labour Party leader Michael Foot, who appeared in Soviet records under the codename Boot. The Foot allegations would later become a public controversy. Foot won substantial libel damages from the Sunday Times in 1995 over the way the story was published. The historical debate over what Foot did or did not know remains contested to this day. By April 1985, Oleg Gordievsky had been confirmed as the resident designate of the KGB in London. The single most senior Soviet intelligence officer in the United Kingdom was a British spy. MI6 had pulled off something the Americans had never managed in their entire history. The intelligence Gordievsky produced was extraordinary. He revealed Operation RYAN, an obsessive KGB program ordered by Yuri Andropov in May 1981 to watch for indicators of a Western nuclear first strike. He documented Soviet paranoia during the NATO exercise called Able Archer, 83 in November of that year, when Moscow Center, briefly and terrifyingly, came to believe that a real attack might be disguised as a drill. He briefed both sides during Mikhail Gorbachev's visit to Chequers on December 16, 1984, the visit after which Margaret Thatcher told the BBC, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." The CIA's own historians would later describe Gordievsky as the West's sole source of information on the Soviet war scare during the early 1980s. To understand the weight of what he was reporting, you have to understand the world of 1983. In March of that year, Ronald Reagan had publicly described the Soviet Union as the evil empire. He had announced, 2 weeks later, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the program American newspapers nicknamed Star Wars. Pershing II missiles were being deployed in West Germany, capable of reaching Soviet command targets in as little as 8 to 10 minutes. In September, a Soviet fighter pilot had shot down a Korean Airlines passenger jet, killing 269 people, including a sitting United States congressman from Georgia named Larry McDonald. The Soviet leadership, dominated by frail and dying old men, was convinced that Reagan was preparing a first strike. The KGB was instructed to watch Western embassies for unusual lights at night, to count cars in the parking lots of NATO headquarters, to check whether senior officials were sending their families out of capital cities. None of these indicators was reliable. All of them were taken seriously. It was in this atmosphere, in early November 1983, that NATO conducted Able Archer, a routine annual exercise simulating the procedures by which the alliance would authorize the release of nuclear weapons. Soviet intelligence, primed for paranoia by Operation RYAN, briefly reported to Moscow that the exercise might be cover for a genuine attack. KGB residencies around the world received an urgent telegram demanding immediate intelligence on Western military readiness. Gordievsky was in London. He saw the telegram. He photographed it. He passed it to MI6, who passed it to Margaret Thatcher, who passed a sanitized version of it to Ronald Reagan. According to multiple American sources, including Reagan's own later writings, this was the moment that began to convince the United States president that the danger of nuclear war was real and that some kind of dialogue with the Soviets had to begin. The full historical impact of Able Archer remains debated by scholars. Some argue that the world came as close to nuclear war in November 1983 as it had during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Others argue that Soviet alarm was real but limited to certain levels of the bureaucracy. What is not in dispute is that Gordievsky was the only Western source inside the KGB during this period, and that the intelligence he provided shaped Western diplomacy for the rest of the decade. He was, in the words of one CIA reviewer, the most valuable spy of the late Cold War. And then, on May 16, 1985, he received a telegram from Moscow. It instructed him to return immediately for consultations regarding his promotion to full resident in London. It was, on the surface, the news he had been working toward for decades. In reality, it was a summons home for execution. Gordievsky knew it almost at once. The wording was wrong. The urgency was wrong. The pretext was too convenient. He later wrote that he was covered in cold sweat as he read it. He told MI6. MI6 told him that an emergency exfiltration plan, codenamed Pimlico, was on standby. They could not order him to go. They could not order him to stay. The decision had to be his. He went. He went because if he refused, his wife and 2 daughters in Moscow would be punished. He went because part of him still hoped he was wrong. He went because, as the historian Christopher Andrew later put it, Oleg simply felt that something was wrong, but he could not yet believe that the system he had penetrated for so long had finally caught up with him. What Gordievsky did not know, and what would not be confirmed for almost a decade, was that 9,000 kilometers away, in the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley, Virginia, an officer named Aldrich Hazen Ames had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington on April 16, 1985, and offered to sell the names of Soviet citizens working for American intelligence in exchange for $50,000. Some scholars believe that an early, partial Ames disclosure in late April or early May 1985 was enough to trigger the KGB investigation into Gordievsky. Others continue to argue that a separate source must have been involved. The historical debate has never been fully resolved. What is certain is that on June 13, 1985, at a Georgetown restaurant called Chadwick's, Ames handed his KGB contact between 5 and 7 pounds of classified documents, identifying more than 10 Western agents inside the Soviet system. Most of the men named in those documents were arrested over the following months. Most were shot. The list of those Ames betrayed reads like a roll call of the most important Soviet sources the West had ever possessed. Major General Dmitry Polyakov, known to American intelligence under several codenames, including Tofhat to the FBI and Baobon to the CIA, had spied for the West for nearly 2 decades. He was arrested in 1986 and executed by firing squad in March 1988. Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet defense engineer who had handed the CIA the technical secrets of Soviet radar and aviation, was arrested on June 9, 1985, and executed in September 1986. The total number of Soviet citizens executed as a direct result of Ames's treason has never been precisely established. The figure is probably between 10 and 25. The historical consensus is that 1985 was the worst year for American human intelligence inside the Soviet Union in the entire Cold War. Gordievsky was already in Moscow by then. He landed at Sheremetyevo Airport on May 19, 1985. The border guard at passport control made a phone call as he handed his documents through the window. When he reached his apartment at 103 Leninsky Prospect, he found that the lock had been disturbed and that the dust on a particular shelf had been moved. His home had been searched. He was being watched. He was, he understood, already a dead man. The only question was when. A few days later, his KGB superior, General Viktor Grushko, deputy head of the first chief directorate, suggested a friendly drive out to a KGB dacha in the woods. 2 unidentified men were waiting. Lunch was served. Gordievsky was given Armenian brandy and sandwiches. The brandy, almost certainly, was laced with a Soviet truth drug, possibly the substance the KGB called SP-117. He woke hours later on a bed, half-dressed, with no clear memory of what had happened in between. The interrogator hectored him for more than 5 hours. "Confess," the man kept repeating. "You have already confessed. Confess again." Gordievsky did not confess. He remembered, of all things, advice that the British traitor Kim Philby had once given to KGB trainees during a lecture. Never confess. Whatever they have on you, deny it. The irony was almost unbearable. Kim Philby, the Cambridge spy who had betrayed Britain to the Soviet Union for 30 years, had escaped to Moscow in 1963 and lived out his life there as a celebrated KGB veteran. He had given lectures to KGB trainees about how to handle Western counterintelligence. Gordievsky had attended one of those lectures. He remembered the cold, precise voice of the old traitor explaining, in fluent Russian inflected with an Edwardian English accent, that the secret of survival under interrogation was the absolute denial of everything. Now, 2 decades later, alone in a KGB dacha with 2 interrogators trying to break him, the man who had betrayed the Soviets used the techniques of the man who had betrayed the British. Philby's lessons had survived, but they were now defending the wrong side. The KGB let him go. They had no proof. They demoted him to a meaningless desk job, sent him to a sanatorium, and put him under constant surveillance. They were waiting for him to make contact with his MI6 handler in Moscow, an act that would justify his arrest and execution. What they did not know was that there was no handler in Moscow. The case was run from London. There were no meetings to observe. There was only an emergency plan and a single signal. Gordievsky retrieved that signal from inside the cellophane covers of his copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. He soaked the binding by candlelight, peeled it apart, and read the operational instructions that had been hidden there years earlier by MI6. He memorized them. He barricaded his apartment door at night with furniture. He waited. On a Tuesday in mid-July, 1985, at approximately 7:30 in the evening, he walked to the bread shop on Kutuzovsky Prospect, stood at the assigned spot, and held up a Safeway bag. To understand why this signal worked, you have to understand who designed it and why. The architect of Operation Pimlico was a quiet, formidable woman in her late 40s named Valerie Pettit, whom Ben McIntyre, in his definitive account, calls Veronica Price. She had spent her career inside MI6's Soviet operations section. She did not look like a spy master. She looked, by all accounts, like a school librarian. But she had built and rehearsed Pimlico since 1978, refining every detail, anticipating every failure mode. British diplomatic families had driven the route from Moscow to the Finnish border every few weeks for years, partly to keep the KGB used to seeing them on it. Pettit had begun designing the plan in 1978 and refined it for 7 years. According to McIntyre's account, the route from Moscow to the Finnish border was rehearsed by ordinary British diplomats travelling north on weekend trips, so that any actual escape attempt would look indistinguishable from the dozens of holiday journeys that had preceded it. The cassette tape that would signal safety on the Finnish side, Sibelius's tone poem Finlandia, was chosen because it was distinctively national, instantly recognizable, and unlikely to be confused with any other piece of music a diplomatic family might happen to be playing. Every detail of the plan was committed to paper. Every detail was committed to memory. The plan was elegantly simple. If Gordievsky was ever in immediate danger, he would stand at the bread shop on Kutuzovsky Prospect every Tuesday at 7:30 in the evening, holding a Safeway bag. MI6 would confirm the signal had been received by sending an officer to walk past him, carrying a Harrods bag and visibly eating a chocolate bar. According to the historian Christopher Andrew, either a Mars bar or a Kit Kat would qualify, but on the day in question, it was a Mars bar. The chocolate bar was the unfakeable element. A British supermarket bag could conceivably turn up in Moscow by accident. A British diplomat eating Western chocolate while walking past a bread shop in the middle of the city on the exact assigned day, at the exact assigned time, could not. Once the signal was confirmed, Gordievsky would have to make his own way, alone, to a precise lay-by on the highway north of Leningrad, near a kilometre marker outside the city of Vyborg, where two MI6 officers would be waiting with a car. The boot of the car had been modified. He would be hidden inside it, under a foil thermal blanket designed to defeat the heat-sensitive cameras at the Soviet-Finnish border. From there, with the help of two diplomatic wives and a great deal of luck, he would be smuggled out of the Soviet Union and into the West. No Western intelligence service had ever exfiltrated an active agent from Moscow under live KGB surveillance. The CIA's most valuable Soviet asset, Adolf Tolkachev, was caught in June of that same year and executed soon after. The British scientist Greville Wynne, who had served as the courier for the great Soviet defector Oleg Penkovsky, had been arrested in the early 1960s. Penkovsky himself had been shot. The Moscow rules, the unwritten code by which Western intelligence officers operated inside the Soviet capital, said that a successful exfiltration from inside the USSR was effectively impossible. Pimlico was the bet that the impossible could be done if the plan was simple enough, the people committed enough, and the KGB, just for a moment, distracted enough. When Oleg Gordievsky stood outside that bread shop on the Tuesday evening in mid-July, the MI6 watcher, who had been assigned to keep an eye on the signal site, missed him. The Asquiths, however, did not. Raymond Asquith, Viscount Asquith of Morley, the great-grandson of the British Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith, was the head of the MI6 station in Moscow. He was driving home from work with his wife Claire when he glanced toward the bread shop. He saw a short, thick-set man holding a Safeway plastic bag with the supermarket logo unmistakable against the grey of the Moscow street. According to Ben McIntyre's reconstruction of the moment, drawn from interviews with the participants years afterward, Asquith later said his heart went straight to his toes. The car was bugged. He could not say a word to his wife. He simply drove on. The next day, an MI6 officer named Andrew Gibbs, who appears in McIntyre's book under the pseudonym Arthur G., returned to Kutuzovsky Prospect. He carried a Harrods bag. He ate a Mars bar. He walked past the spot where Gordievsky stood. As he passed, he stared straight at him. Gordievsky later described the moment in words that have become part of espionage history. As he passed within 4 or 5 yards, he stared straight at me. I gazed into his eyes, shouting silently, "Yes, it's me. I need urgent help." That single bite, that single locked gaze, that single Mars bar, told Gordievsky that the entire weight of the British state was now moving on his behalf. London had been cabled. Margaret Thatcher's private secretary, Charles Powell, was already on his way to Balmoral, where the Prime Minister was on holiday. Thatcher would, according to McIntyre, give her authorization without hesitation, saying simply, "We have to honour our promises to our agent." The Balmoral scene that followed has become a small piece of espionage folklore. According to accounts authorised by McIntyre's research, Powell arrived at the Scottish Royal Estate, carrying the most sensitive briefing papers in the British intelligence system. He needed to reach the Prime Minister immediately. He was told, however, that the Queen Mother had mislaid her video recorder and that the household was occupied helping her search for it so that she could watch an episode of the British sitcom Dad's Army. Powell waited. The recorder was found. The episode began. Only then did the Prime Minister receive him, read the cable, and authorise Operation Pimlico. The Queen Mother, who never learned what had taken place under her roof, watched her sitcom uninterrupted. The most senior British intelligence asset of the Cold War, meanwhile, had 3 days to live, unless the British state moved fast enough to save him. 3 days later, on Friday, July 19, 1985, Oleg Gordievsky put on a tracksuit, told himself he was going for a jog, slipped through the bushes outside his apartment block, and ran. He took the metro. He took an overnight train from Leningrad station to Leningrad itself. From there, he caught a suburban electric train to a small station called Zelenogorsk, then boarded a bus toward Vyborg. He pretended to be sick, got off, and walked along the highway looking for the precise bend in the road that he had been told to memorize. He had no map. He had no radio. He had only the plan in his head. The journey north would have taken any ordinary Soviet citizen well over a day. For Gordievsky, traveling at the pace of public transportation, hiding among ordinary passengers, watching constantly for the KGB watchers he was sure had not yet realized he was missing, every hour was an exercise in calculated normality. In a 30th anniversary interview with Radio Free Europe in 2015, he described the strange, dreamlike quality of those hours. "Many times," he said, "I was saying to myself, it's like a movie, it's like a movie. Look at it. Am I watching a movie about myself?" The most wanted spy in the Soviet Union was, at that moment, the most invisible commuter on the Leningrad line. Meanwhile, 2 diplomatic cars were leaving Moscow, also heading north. In the first, a Ford Sierra, were Raymond Asquith, his wife Claire, and their 15-month-old daughter. In the second car, a Saab, were Andrew Gibbs and his wife Rachel. The cars were tailed by 3 KGB vehicles. At one point, a slow goods train at a level crossing separated the British cars from their Soviet pursuers. The Asquiths and the Gibbs accelerated, took a turning behind a low hill, and vanished from KGB view. By the time the watchers caught up, the convoy had reached the lay-by near kilometre marker 836. The British diplomats laid out a roadside picnic. A few cars passed, a few seconds of total silence, and then, from the trees, a small, exhausted figure in a corduroy jacket emerged. Andrew Gibbs is reported by McIntyre as later joking that they had been expecting a spy and that what came out of the forest looked instead like a forest troll. The whole encounter, by McIntyre's reconstruction, lasted barely more than a minute. Gordievsky was bundled into the modified boot of the Ford Sierra. The foil thermal blanket was placed over him. The boot lid was closed. The cars drove on toward the border. The Soviet-Finnish frontier crossing at Vyborg, on a Saturday afternoon in summer, was a sleepy place. The guards were tired. The cars were diplomatic. The papers were in order. And then a customs officer walked over with a sniffer dog. What happened next has entered the textbooks of intelligence training. Claire Asquith, with the perfect timing of a woman who had spent years preparing for a moment she hoped would never come, lifted her daughter onto the boot lid of the Ford Sierra, opened the baby's freshly soiled nappy, and began to change her there, in the open air, directly above the place where Oleg Gordievsky lay hidden. The first dog turned away from the smell. Rachel Gibbs scattered cheese and onion crisps onto the ground. The second dog ate them. The cars were waved through. A few minutes later, on the Finnish side of the border, Raymond Asquith reached into the dashboard, took out a cassette tape, and pushed it into the player. The tone poem Finlandia, composed by the Finnish national composer Jean Sibelius, began to play through the car's speakers. It was the prearranged signal, agreed in advance, that Gordievsky would hear from inside the boot if he had reached safety. He heard it. And he wept. Across the border, in Finland, the cars stopped at a forest clearing. The boot was opened. Oleg Gordievsky climbed out and was met by a second MI6 team that included Valerie Pettit herself, the woman who had spent 7 years preparing the operation that had just saved his life. He had been hidden, by then, for hours. He was alive. He was free. The single largest operational download in MI6 history, as Ben McIntyre would later call it, was complete. It is tempting, looking back, to call this a story about a chocolate bar, but the chocolate bar was only the visible tip of something much larger. Pimlico worked because of a series of decisions and constraints that, taken together, no other intelligence service in the world could have replicated. The first constraint was scale. MI6 in 1985 had perhaps 2,000 staff. The KGB had nearly 500,000. The CIA had a budget so vast it could fund parallel operations and accept that some would fail. MI6 could not afford failure on this scale. Every officer in the chain had to know the operation personally. Every detail had to be rehearsed, and crucially, the circle of knowledge had to be kept so tight that even the Americans were not told until after the exfiltration was complete. This compartmentalization is almost certainly why Aldrich Ames, who had access to virtually every CIA secret about Soviet operations, was unable to betray Pimlico. He did not know it existed. The second constraint was time. MI6 had been running Gordievsky since 1974. Valerie Pettit had been refining the exfiltration plan since 1978. By the time it was activated, every kilometer of the route had been driven dozens of times. Every cover story had been tested. Every diplomatic family that was used had been deliberately chosen so that the KGB was already familiar with their movements. The KGB saw nothing unusual on July 19 because the British had spent 7 years making the unusual look ordinary. The third constraint was philosophy. The CIA in this period preferred technical solutions, satellites, listening posts, computational analysis. The KGB preferred mass, an army of watchers and informants. MI6, lacking both the technology of the Americans and the manpower of the Soviets, was forced into a third approach. It bet on individual relationships. It bet that one officer who had spent years patiently building trust with a single agent would, in the end, outperform 1,000 watchers and a satellite constellation. Pimlico was the proof of that bet. There is a final factor, harder to describe but central to everything. Oleg Gordievsky was not paid. He never asked for money. He spied because he had concluded, after many years of personal anguish, that the system he served was a moral catastrophe. The men and women of MI6 who ran him, who designed Pimlico, who drove the route to Vyborg dozens of times, who carried the Harrods bag and ate the Mars bar, were not paid in any sense that mattered either. They could not speak publicly about what they had done. Most of their names would remain classified for decades. Some would not be confirmed until after their deaths. Claire Asquith would never receive a public medal for changing her daughter's nappy on a car boot in front of a Soviet sniffer dog. There was no parade. There was only the quiet certainty, on both sides, that a promise made in a Copenhagen hotel bar more than a decade earlier had been kept. The aftermath was strange and long. Gordievsky was debriefed for 80 days at Fort Monkton in Gosport. The CIA director, William Casey, flew to Britain to consult him on what Ronald Reagan should say to Mikhail Gorbachev at the Geneva summit in November 1985. Gordievsky met Reagan himself in the Oval Office on July 21, 1987, exactly 2 years after his exfiltration. 2 weeks later, on August 5, Reagan recorded in his private diary a brief, slightly misspelled note, then a report on Colonel Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB defector to England. The Casey debriefing at Fort Monkton in late 1985 was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential meetings of the late Cold War. The American CIA director wanted to know exactly what Gorbachev would do at Geneva. Would he negotiate seriously on nuclear weapons? Would he accept American offers to share research on the Strategic Defense Initiative? Gordievsky's answer, drawn from years of reading internal KGB assessments of the new Soviet leader, was unambiguous. Gorbachev would never accept SDI sharing as a serious offer. He would treat it as an American trick. The right strategy, Gordievsky advised, was for Reagan to keep SDI as leverage, force the Soviets to negotiate from a position of economic exhaustion, and refuse to give away technology that the Soviets could not match. Reagan listened. He took the advice. The arms control negotiations of the next 4 years, leading eventually to the INF Treaty of 1987, were shaped, in part, by the words of a KGB colonel in a British safe house. The Soviet Union tried Gordievsky in absentia in November 1985 and sentenced him to death by firing squad. The sentence has never been rescinded by any post-Soviet Russian government. It still stands today. His wife Leila and his 2 young daughters, Maria and Anna, were detained in Moscow for 6 years. Margaret Thatcher personally lobbied Mikhail Gorbachev for their release. They were finally allowed to leave the Soviet Union in September 1991, only weeks before the Soviet state itself collapsed. The strain of separation had destroyed the marriage. Oleg and Leila divorced soon afterward. He spent the rest of his life under MI5 protection, in a quiet house in Surrey, writing books with the British historian Christopher Andrew that revealed KGB operations across decades. He was made a Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in 2007 for services to the security of the United Kingdom. It is the same fictional honour given to James Bond. Oleg Gordievsky died at his home in Godalming, Surrey, on March 4, 2025. He was 86 years old. The story, in the years that followed, became a kind of parable about the right way to fight an authoritarian state, not with overwhelming force, not with limitless budgets, not with the brute mass of 500,000 watchers, but with patience, with tradecraft, with the willingness to bet everything on a single human being, and with the discipline to keep that bet quiet for decades. The Mars bar by itself was nothing. A piece of chocolate, mass-produced in a factory in England. What made it the most important confectionery in the history of espionage was the network of decisions behind it, the 7 years of planning, the hundreds of practice drives to Viborg, the compartmentalization that locked out even the Americans, the trust between an unpaid Russian colonel and a small British service that had decided, once, that it would never abandon a man it had asked to risk everything. There is one detail in this story that historians return to again and again. When the second MI6 officer was sent to confirm the signal on the day after Gordievsky first stood at the bread shop, he was given a choice of chocolate bars. Either a Mars bar or a Kit Kat would have been accepted under the rules of the plan. He chose the Mars bar. We will probably never know exactly why. Perhaps it was simply what was on the shelf at the embassy commissary. Perhaps he liked the sound of the wrapper. Perhaps it was a moment of small, human, unremarkable decision, the kind that almost no one in history is ever asked to remember. But for one man standing on Kutuzovsky Prospect in the summer of 1985, that small, unremarkable decision was the difference between living and dying, between the firing squad and the Surrey countryside, between a body in an unmarked grave and 40 more years of life. Sometimes the largest things in history turn on the smallest objects: a loose nail in a horseshoe, a telegram delivered to the wrong desk, a plastic bag from a British supermarket, a bite of chocolate eaten in plain sight on a wide Moscow avenue by a man who did not look back. The KGB was watching everything. It just was not watching closely enough to see that the most important act of espionage of the entire decade had just walked past it, chewing,